Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Coaches Corner University podcast. I'm your host, Paul O'Neid, and as usual, we are brought to you by Coaches Corner U. Please go visit www.coachescorneru.com and register for our education collective with close to 200 hours of continuing education resources, as well as discounts on all of our courses. We do have the discount code still in effect, podcast 300, which gives you lifetime access for $50. And we are making some changes to the platform. So in the next coming months, there will be massive changes to the platform, and we're switching to a subscription model. But if you register now, you will get lifetime access and all the perks that come along with that subscription model. We're also sponsored by TC Nutrition, Barefoot Shoes, and Bacon and Barbells. You'll find links to all of those in the description below. Today, I'm joined by Michael Elrod Erickson, coach, educator, and friend of mine. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Why don't you give the listeners just a little bit of a background on you?
Sure. So I started lifting weights when I was 14 because I played basketball, and the high school basketball coach introduced me to it. He took me to the weight room and showed me a couple movements. And like at first, I was like, oh, that was kind of cool, but it wasn't anything like crazy special. But then I actually didn't make the high school basketball team. I tried out and didn't make the team, partially because my grandfather passed away, like literally the day before, 2 days before. Yeah. But then at that point, I was like, okay, I'm going to like start taking lifting weights seriously because I want to come back and make the team next year and do better.
Like a Michael Jordan story. You don't make the team, you come back, you're the greatest player alive.
I guess, yeah. And like that's whenever I got into lifting consistently, but I'd say it was like my first breakup, as corny as it sounds.
No,
where it's like, okay, like listening to loud music and lifting really heavy is pretty sick.
Makes all the head noises go quiet.
Yeah. And that was kind of the introduction to powerlifting from there. That was whenever I got into like 1 rep maxes.
Okay.
So from there, like I kind of just got obsessed with it. I'm a bit of a nerd. Mm-hmm. So I tried to like learn as much about it as I could. So I got my first certification whenever I was 15 from Westside Barbell.
Wait, you did the Westside Barbell certification when you were 15?
Yep.
That's awesome.
Because it didn't have an age minimum on it. Like I wanted to get my CSCS, but you have to have your college degree for that. So right. I had to wait another 7 or 8 years or whatever. So yeah, that was where I got started. And then from there, we had a new track coach my junior year of high school. So I essentially just went into his office and I was like, hey, I heard that you're the new coach for the track team. I think lifting weights would be super helpful for track athletes. Could I coach the team? And for whatever reason, he said yes, I guess because it took stuff off of his plate. So I coached my high school track team for 2 seasons. I did my first strength and conditioning internship between junior and senior year of high school at a sports performance facility called Chadwick's. They work with a lot of like middle school, high school, MLB kind of athletes.
And that's local to you?
It was in Franklin. Okay. So I drove like 45 minutes each way every day all summer.
Nice.
Yeah. And then I don't know like how robust you want, but like that's kind of where I got started. And then I just stuck with it all through college. So I've done probably like 5 strength and conditioning internships by now, including some prestigious places like Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning and Kabuki Strength most recently.
Dude, the reason I wanted to dive in is because number one, the certifications are one thing. I think people can go and they can get certified and, whatever. You do a weekend course, you do an online course. And obviously I think that's great because I offer them on my website. But at the end of the day, that hands-on internship type of education is something that is irreplaceable. And for you to sit there and be like, all right, I just graduated university, but I've already had 5 different high-level internships under my belt. You can't replicate that number of sets, reps, eyes on athletes that you would have being in a weight room. Of those 5 places, what are maybe the 3 biggest lessons that you have from your time interning?
Sure. Um, I'd say I actually learned a lot at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning. Even though it was probably my least favorite internship that I ever did. So the culture was not necessarily centered around like training theory or programming or any of the things that I found cool. It was very much just like be personable, be likable by clients, yeah. Which is not the parts that like appealed to me. But I got like lots of great lessons out of that. So, like if a client's doing an exercise where they're laying on the ground or something like that, don't like stand over them. Make sure that you're like actually trying to get down on their level. So, like
Hmm.
kneel next to them or something like that. Um, like little things like that, as well as,
The soft skills.
yeah,
Yeah.
as well as essentially just to like how to talk to people that you don't necessarily know yet or have anything in common with. Because it ranged from like gen pop to athletes of like all different age levels.
Well, I mean, that's hard, especially when you're approaching it with an analytical mind. And I find that especially relatable because early on in my coaching career, I was very much an X's and O's guy. I was a hard ass. You're going to do as I say, and that's the end of the conversation. And to be fair, it wasn't until I learned those soft skills and learned how to communicate that I actually found people getting better results. So I think it's a phenomenal lesson.
Yeah.
What's next?
Um, I'd say another big one was realizing that people are not doing things perfectly, like even at big organizations.
Yep.
There's still a lot of things that could be improved upon. And that was helpful in terms of like feeling like I could start my own business because I realized like if all these big organizations have made it to their size while doing things imperfectly, like it's okay if I don't do things perfectly as well.
Yeah. I mean, we're all always growing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and you only learn as you do. So I love that. What's the third lesson?
So in terms of like specific knowledge, I'd say Kabuki strength was pretty much like perfect for my career
Okay.
in terms of like transitioning to powerlifting. I kind of skipped over it earlier, but like another big part of being at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning was realizing that I didn't want to work with athletes. I
Okay.
couldn't, yeah, I couldn't stand athletes or gym pop clients because they were just lifting to get an outcome. Like what they care about is sports or losing weight or whatever. And like what I care about is lifting weights. So I would much rather work with clients that also like actually care about lifting weights. And that was helpful for realizing that. And that's part of why I went to Kabuki Strength for the next internship because that helped me realize that I wanted to go into powerlifting specifically rather than like collegiate strength and conditioning.
Well, listen, man, as someone who did collegiate strength conditioning for a long time, there's a very select few people who actually can make a living and do it long term. But it's interesting you say that, like, I, the type of client you want to work with. And this is I've had actually two strength coaches on in the last couple of days who both spoke about the fact that they were fascinated with the notion that the ends, like, so if you're dealing with a lifter, lifting is the ends and the means.
Yep.
Whereas with an athlete, it's a means to an end. What I think that, we fail to understand in a lot of cases is that process orientation is really, really important. So for you, in my impression is it's probably how you get to that end goal that matters more to you than the actual end goal.
Yep. And just like what I get to do when working with people that like want to have powerlifting goals versus just like it's a means to an end. Like the actual programming and coaching aspects are more interesting.
Do you find it increases the buy-in of the athlete when they realize that, like, okay, well, this is actually something I have to do?
Um, I wouldn't necessarily view it that way, but I would say like it's an important mindset shift. Like if you want to be a good power lifter or lifter in general, you have to view it as like this is the thing itself. Like this is a skill that needs practicing,
Okay.
and I need to do it like as repeatable as possible, as opposed to just this is a means to an end. Like I'm trying to get something out of doing this.
Yeah, I like the way you reframe that because the way I was coming at it, especially when I was at the high level D1, you'd have guys who were just successful in spite of their own efforts. Like, guys who would just show guys and girls who would just show up and just ball out of control, but they couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you deal with on the other side of things, powerlifters who, for all intents and purposes, do all the work. They put in the effort, they do the correctives, they do the nutrition. Yet, and they're still progressing, but they might not be progressing at a very high rate. Yet they still continue to show up and execute. And it's a very different mindset.
Yeah.
Do you lean on your own athletic pursuits at all within your coaching practice?
How do you mean that?
So, like, you compete in powerlifting.
Yeah.
How much does that play into the way that you coach?
So it definitely helps. Like I would say, uh, you should probably lift, or at least have lifted fairly seriously for a while if you want to coach powerlifting. But I wouldn't necessarily consider myself to be like an elite level lifter. And I don't think reaching that kind of level is necessary for like being a good coach. Like in some ways, I think more mediocre lifters kind of have to learn and figure out stuff more than the ones that just like naturally excelled.
Yeah. Yeah. It's something I've heard Dave speak about a lot. He's like, you don't necessarily, in fact, some of the best athletes make the worst coaches because they've never actually had to do that troubleshooting because everything works. Whereas, you know, you mentioned it yourself, you said you're not the best lifter. So you've had to try to find ways and troubleshoot and triage to find different ways to accomplish the goal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that. Now, that's also played into, you mentioned a number of certifications as well. You got your West Side certification at 15. Then I think 3 years before that, when you were 12, you did your Prescript certification.
Not at 12, but I was 18, something like that. I hadn't even started college just yet.
I love that. What were some other certifications that you took that you felt were worthwhile?
Sure. Uh, so it's not meant to be a shameless plug, but the USPA has a powerlifting coach certification. And I initially took that while at Kabuki, and since then I've become an educator for their program. But I would say we do a really good job of covering everything about actual meet day coaching in a way that like no other certification that I've seen does. So timing your warm-ups relative to like what's going on the platform so that you're not just like sitting around getting cold for 20 minutes after you're done, like dumb stuff like that. Uh, like how to choose attempts, water cuts, like all the kind of stuff that is outside of just training that normally doesn't get touched on.
Which is so important because that's usually the stuff that's going to make or break a meet.
Yeah. And a lot of time, like coaches will spend, I don't know, like 10 years coaching powerlifting to like learn and figure out those things by just like trial and error.
Yep.
Whereas you can just take a course and learn a lot of it now.
What do you think? Okay, so that's a great point, and I kind of want to lean into that a little bit because I have a hard time reconciling people who will take courses in so many of the same genres versus the way you did it is seeking education across multiple verticals of this. We're still talking powerlifting, but you're going into West Side and then you're going to Prescript, then you're going to USPA, then you're going to Kabuki. How do you reconcile that there are so many different ways to accomplish the singular goal of progressing powerlifting?
I would say like your mindset around training is kind of like sculpting. Like whenever you get started, you just have to add a whole bunch of stuff and like get material to work with. But at some point, you have to also like start pulling stuff away and kind of shaping it. So a lot of it is kind of figuring out like, okay, these are the things that I think are accurate and I agree with, whereas these are the things that I don't, and like sticking with the ones that work versus the things that don't.
What were some ways that you actually figured out like what works and what doesn't? Because obviously that wasn't just your own opinion.
Sure. Uh, Commonalities is a pretty good sign, right? Like if a
Okay.
lot of people preach the same kind of thing, it's more likely to be accurate than like some random guy on the internet says something very controversial. Um, Also, like evidence. If you've
Okay.
tried it and it works, if you've done it with clients and it works, um, professional opinion is essentially like evidence from other people.
Okay.
Uh, so, like, I think science based or evidence based is like very popular these days,
Hmm.
and it definitely plays a role in how I shape my philosophy. But so do all those other things. Like, I don't just dismiss the other avenues. I kind of like try and draw from all of them.
Well, at the end of the day, evidence based is also like practice, right? What you are implementing or what other people have implemented. And that lends itself to kind of the next question is surrounding yourself with people who are of similar mind to you and trying to progress and challenging ideas. Like, how have you sought out those people to try and, push your boundaries?
I would say like peers are a lot harder to find than mentors. Uh, but in terms of like mentorship type stuff, I got a lot of that from internships, and then just keep in touch and like have good relations with the people that you worked with there. And then also like having a coach myself. Shout out Stuart Locke, Kodiak Barbell. I think he's one of the best, and he's been super influential in terms of shaping my own like philosophy and the way that I want to run my business.
Yeah, I mean, having worked with Stuart for 6 years, it's for me it's cool because when I started coaching Stuart, he was just a personal trainer at a local gym, and then he learned from me, he learned from Jordan Shallow, he learned from every other person he possibly could, and kind of brought himself to a point where he has his own framework. Seems like you've kind of followed that same trajectory.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think whether people admit it or not, like probably the biggest influence on how you train other people is what you've experienced with your own training. Uh, so like who you've been coached by is probably one of the biggest factors in terms of like shaping your own perspective. Uh, so it's kind of funny in that you probably have had a trickle down effect into like how I coach as well. Uh, since you worked with Stu and then
Yeah,
I've worked with him since.
for sure. And one of the things that I actually wanted to ask you, because I know you've worked with Stuart for a long time, would you ever consider seeking coaching from somebody else simply for the opportunity to learn a different way of doing things? Do you need multiple coaches to be able to form your own frameworks?
So I think it's a very valid question. Like from a learning perspective, I do think it would be cool to like see how other people do it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I think the relationship is something that's also a huge part of coaching. And Stu has just been like a pretty much a perfect fit for me in
Mm-hmm.
that I'm more of a like neurotic, analytical overthinker. Uh, and he'll pretty much just tell me like, don't be a pussy, just do this or just
Yeah.
stick to the plan, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Which frankly like balances me out in the way that I need. So I think it's a perfect fit, and I don't see any reason to change.
Yeah. And that's when I ask the question, knowing full well that there's no right answer, because what you said is exactly true. So whenever I'm asked similar, it's like, as long as you don't become a watered down version of your coach, and you're still actively seeking to learn and actively seeking to challenge your ideas outside of your own coaching relationship with your coach, I think you're okay. So by definition, it's not a prerequisite that you have a lot of coaches in order to be the best coach. But I do think that if you silo yourself, and I can think of a million people off the top of my head that fall into this category. You see, well, I'll call them out. You see it a lot with prescript. So people will go through prescript and then they'll think they have this wonderful understanding of biomechanics, but then they don't expose themselves to other frameworks. And then they become a watered down version of Jordan Shallow and start wearing flannel and growing beards. Oh, and in the same breath, you have people who only go into N1 education with Kasim Hansen, or only go into Kabuki Strength, or only go into RTS with Mike Tashir, and you end up just as like with this watered down Mike Tashir.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that is the biggest discredit you can do to your own career. Because ultimately, your inability to expose yourself to alternate viewpoints handicaps your ability to deal with multiple people. So I'm glad that you kind of feel that way and you align in that direction, because I think especially as an educator, that's your biggest asset. Because how many people that you deal with or you work with in these courses have the same approach as you do to training?
Like no one.
Then how
I
do
would
you
say
teach them?
like, sure. I would say I have a bit of a unique perspective in that like I have background from various different places. You know, like most people in the powerlifting world would not have gone to Mike Boyle strength and conditioning, where they don't believe in back squatting uh, or like straight bar deadlifts, and all they preach is like unilateral work.
Okay, how do you feel about that?
Um, okay. For powerlifters, it's like a clear no brainer. If your entire sport is centered around these big bilateral lifts, then like you have to train those.
Right.
Uh, for athletes, it becomes a bit more of a gray zone. Like I don't necessarily think that back squats or deadlifts or any of these things are bad for athletes, but there are certainly situations where it's worth using different exercises. Like don't
Yep.
be married to a certain thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but my big criticism of like the approach that they took at Mike Boyle strength and conditioning is a lot of the unilateral movements were lacking enough stability to like actually push force output or
Yep.
drive hypertrophy. Uh, and then also, frankly, the training is set up in a way where they're trying to get a lot done in not a lot of time. So they can kind of churn a bunch of people through the facility in a day.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to like very short rest times as well, which just furthers that. So now you've got like two or three different factors leaning towards not actually being able to push strength or hypertrophy as much as you could otherwise. So I would like to see athletes tend to do a little more like, uh, I guess you could say, traditional strength training, in that
Yep.
like push things hard, have full rest times in between, that sort of stuff.
Well, that's a perfect example of, because you have had exposure to multiple frameworks, you can then look at the way someone does something and steel man the argument for the way they do it, but then also straw man it in the other direction to kind of realize, okay, this probably isn't something that's going to work for me and my athlete population. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's probably not something that you're going to use very often.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows? Maybe you have a client who uh, can't back squat for whatever reason, and you're looking at ways that we can continue to still drive adaptation. Well, look at that. You have a tool in your toolbox.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of stuff happens all the time. Like, there's a dude at the local gym that I was chatting to the other day, and he's like, I haven't been able to squat or deadlift in years. Uh, I just essentially like don't train legs. And I'm like, you do realize how many countless other options there are for training your legs, right? Like, it blows my mind that people are so attached to these traditional ways.
Does it blow your mind though?
Not really, because I guess it took what, like 8 or 9 years of like experience and education to get to the point where I am, and most people are not making like lifting the centerpiece of their life. Uh, it's just sometimes hard to like put yourself back in the like average perspective when you've like dug into it so much yourself, you know?
Oh, dude, absolutely. And that's why I asked you the question, because I think I was having this conversation the other day with a friend of mine who is he's the head strength coach at Colorado College. He used to be the associate director at Penn State. And we were talking about doing a course on jump training. And I had to stop him and I'm like, bro, like you have forgotten more information than the coaches who are going to take this course have ever learned.
Yeah.
You need to take a step back. And I think teaching and being in that environment with beginner coaches allows you to stay grounded a little bit more, would you say?
Yeah. I'd say the other interesting thing is like the dynamics of coaching are kind of changing with social media and like how readily available like education is, at
Okay.
least in the powerlifting world, where like your average athlete wants to like seek out knowledge. I don't know if that's necessarily the case in like traditional athletics, but at least in our little world, it's like your average person is becoming more and more knowledgeable about the sport and like trying to learn on their own.
Steel man the argument for why that's a bad thing.
That one's a very easy argument. Uh, sure, it's it's literally like my entire life and job to like try and understand these things.
Right.
Whereas for them, it's just they're kind of like dabbling in it.
Uh-huh.
So it's very easy for them to see one thing as opposed to like the whole picture and think they know like what the best move is.
Right.
Uh, so whether that's they saw a new cue on TikTok or Instagram and they want to go try it out at the gym whenever it is not something that they should be trying, they should be focusing on like something else. And
Yeah.
then suddenly their lifts look way worse. Or they substitute out like uh, accessory movement for a different one that they saw online that was new and shiny without necessarily understanding like some of the underlying reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like that happens all the time now because of that.
Yeah.
Like an easy example, uh, like an incline dumbbell curl. A
Yeah.
lot of people are like, "Oh, that's just training my biceps." When in reality, it's like there's a lot of layers to it. It could be like a shoulder mobility drill to like try and get you better at low bar squats
Totally.
because you're in like shoulder extension with arms behind the body under load, like trying to open that up.
Yep.
So
Yeah,
if
for
someone just
sure.
swaps that out for a different curl, they're not realizing that like it might have been there for shoulder mobility, not just training your biceps.
I think so. I totally agree with you on every level, but I think the prevalence of educational content, however flawed, forces you as a coach now to be so much on your game. Because if you're not, the client coming in has enough prerequisite knowledge to call you on your shit. Because if you can't answer why, they probably have a why behind whatever they're choosing because they heard the why from so and so influencer. So I actually like it. I think it's going to weed out over time a lot of these coaches who have no business coaching. And I also think that it forces us to coach harder, plain and simple, to just actually educate our clients into the whys of what we're doing, how it applies to them, the primary, secondary, and tertiary layers involved in what we're programming. And I personally find that really fun.
Yeah. I mean, I love it because my favorite people to work with tend to be like clients that like want to actually know about what they're doing.
Yeah,
Not necessarily the ones that are just like, oh, I'm going to put my head down and do the work. I want the ones that are like asking like, oh, why are we doing this? And trying to like grow their understanding of the sport.
absolutely. So your primary client audience tends to be more beginner lifters who are just starting out in the sport. You coach the university's powerlifting team. What are some lessons? Let's go like maybe 5 lessons that we can go into that you think you do a great job of coaching with young lifters.
Sure. I would say I've worked with pretty much like the full spectrum. Like I'm the assistant coach for Team USA in the IPL. I helped untested female hit her first like 500-pound 3 times body weight squat and go from like 470 to 500 dots in 6 months.
Wild.
Yeah. Uh, but I do think I'm pretty good with the like young power lifter as well. And like you said, I coach a collegiate team at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Um, so yeah, I do feel like that's an area that I can talk pretty well on.
Yeah.
So if I had to pick out like 5 key things for them to like prioritize, the first one we almost touched on a little bit earlier. It's like the intent behind training. They
Okay.
need to reframe like doing their squat, bench, and deadlift as like these are the skills of my sport that I'm trying to practice and master, as opposed to just these are a means to an end of like getting stronger or getting bigger. Um, so the most basic thing there is just try and make it a repeatable skill that you're doing as well as you can.
Yeah.
So like if you were shooting a free throw, you're not gonna spin the ball and then dribble, and then the next time that you're doing it, rather than doing that, you're like spinning it behind your back and going between your
Right.
legs or whatever. You would just do the same thing every time. But you would be amazed how many lifters like don't have the same setup every time in terms of like I stick my feet here, I take a step, I do whatever.
Yeah, but you also get the other direction where you get the sumo deadlifter who's like, crush the bug, shake the arms, crush the bug again, shake the arms, set your back, let your back go, dip down to the bar, set your hook, unset your hook. Like the meme of the sumo deadlifter. Yeah, but I totally agree. I totally agree. The routine of lifting and lifting as a skill. And that is something that as they progress in their lifting careers is going to allow them to deal with the pressures that come along with higher level performance. Um, there's a concept called motor engrams. Are you familiar with this concept?
No.
Okay, so a motor engram is essentially a motor pattern,
Okay.
but there's variations in your motor patterns based on the inputs that you're getting from the environment. So visual, auditory, even temperature. So the way that you perform a squat in the dark in silence is going to be different than the way you perform it in a bright room, is going to be different than the way you perform it if someone walks in front of you, someone yells, what music you're listening to. All of these different inputs create different engrams. But if you have an anchor to your performance, like a routine setup, it allows you to create more stability in those engrams and allows you to make them more consistent one after the other after the other. So I think on the very basic, like a young lifter, just develop that routine.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And like
perfect.
the other layer to that is just like actually have intent when you're lifting. So like focus and try hard. Those should be pretty obvious, but like
Yep,
a lot of
probably.
people need that. Like actually focus and try hard when you're getting under the bar. So even if it's a lighter weight, like treat it with the same level of respect and like put force into the bar like you would if it was heavy.
Do you find that's tough with young lifters?
Uh, yeah, a lot of them need the like actual weight on the bar in order to like force them into trying
Yeah,
hard or like creating tension.
yeah. I found the same thing. I'm glad you reinforced that one for me. All right,
Yeah.
what's next?
Um, I'd say the next thing is like learning to kind of gauge intensity. So
Okay.
Stuart Locke would just say like everyone's a pussy and they need to learn to try hard.
Yep.
I would say there's some merit to that because things like split squats or dumbbell RDLs or like movements that are perceptually like challenging,
Yep.
uh, like it feels hard when you're doing it. A lot of people are gonna go way lighter than they need to.
Yep.
Like you could look at someone using a 40-pound dumbbell and be like, all right, you could do a 90 right now. Realistically, they're probably not going to be down to do that. So just tell them like, okay, I want you to go up 10 pounds per week for the next month until they actually get to that point.
Yep.
Um, but I see just as much as the opposite of that. Uh, so it'll be, oh, I want a single with 2 reps in reserve or
Mm-hmm.
like RPE 8 or whatever.
Yep.
You tell your athlete that, and then the next moment you turn around and they just fail the single, and you're like, what happened?
Yeah.
Because like you and I would never fail a single at RPE 8. Like the margin for error of like going from missed lift to 2 reps in reserve is pretty big. Um, so it's not just they need to learn to try hard; they also need to learn how to gauge submaximal work. And submaximal work is really important when trying to like learn the skill, because if you're always maxing out and your technique is always breaking down, then you're never gonna like have the chance to practice doing it well.
Well, there's a lot to tease out of that. So, you mentioned the perceptual difficulty as a gauge for like how much load should I be using. That one to me is always interesting because you'll find lifters will cut a set when it becomes hard, not cut a set when they've failed. So you didn't like a leg extension is a perfect example because a leg extension burns like fucking crazy. So they'll start to slow down and they'll get that lactic acid buildup and they'll be like, oh, I can't do one more. But if you're there in person, you just coax them through it and they end up getting like 7, 8 more reps, even when they thought they were at failure. And the same goes for the dumbbell RDL or the Bulgarian split squats are notorious for this.
Yeah.
When I have, albeit she is a pro, my wife is a female athlete who can Bulgarian split squat more than most of my super heavyweights. And not because she's stronger, but because she's able to tolerate more discomfort. So there's that element of intensity. But then there's the other element of intensity that, to be fair, I had so much trouble with this as a lifter myself, is that relative intensity of single rep effort. Because on the one hand, even when I was squatting over 800 pounds, 600 pounds was still an RPE 10. It sucked, right? It just like from 6 to 7 to 7 to 8, like it just sucked. And it didn't suck anymore when you add 100 more pounds. It just sucked. But understanding that, as you mentioned, like an RPE 8, there should be no failure there. There should be no technical breakdown. There should be an element of effort. But then there also factors in, and maybe you can speak to this too, like what are the factors that go into RPE? Because it's not just proximity to failure.
Sure. So before we get to that, I feel like the biggest thing is like most people just need to reflect more. Like the way that
Okay.
you get better at gauging uh, what intensity it was or what weight you should be using for a desired intensity for the next time is like after each set, actually take the time to like sit down and be like, okay, I think I could have done 2 more reps. If you never actually like stop and think about that, then how are you going to know for the next time?
Yeah, for sure. What
And
about
then,
like, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
and then on the topic of uh, like RPE, I
Mhm.
tend to mostly just use the like reps in reserve based kind of system.
Okay.
So like some people draw a distinction between rate of perceived exertion and like how many more reps you could do. I prefer to just anchor it on like reps in reserve. And in fact, with most clients, I just like use the terminology of reps in reserve as opposed to RPE as well.
It's much more simple. I was speaking to Ross Lapella, who works with Mike Tashir, and we did an entire podcast a while back on RPE because to me the distinction between RPE and RIR is the multifactorial nature of perceived exertion. So if you are depressed, if you are overly stimulated or aroused prior to the training session with music or with demon thoughts in your head, right? It's all going to change your perception of your exertional effort. And it's important to me, it's important to draw that delineation, especially as you get stronger and more skillful, because your performance will be so much more variable based on those impacts. And it was after speaking to Ross that I really started to think about, rather than using RPE as a proxy for RIR, truly diving into that auto regulation principle, in that your RPE 8 performance on a weekly basis, if you were to hit a single week after week after week, if you were true to that RPE 8, it would not be a linear climb. There
Sure.
would be like a distinct undulation there. Whereas if you rated it off of a reps and reserve model, you may very well either remain static in your performance or have somewhat of a linear climb in your performance, but it's artificial when it comes to the peaking process.
I would say it doesn't necessarily make a difference in my opinion
Okay.
because say I've got my top set of squat this week.
Uh-huh.
The unstated expectation is like you're focused, you're trying hard, you get aroused enough to like perform well, get hyped
Mm-hmm.
up. Uh, and like if I'm doing those things, the levels of the stuff that you were talking about should be fairly similar. So obviously, like the auto regulation part is still important. Like that's why I'm using a reps and reserve based system
Right.
or RPE based system as opposed to like just here's a percentage.
Yeah.
So like yes, the weight will fluctuate, um, but I don't think it necessarily makes a difference if it's RPE or RIR is written on the sheet. Like that auto regulation is still going to happen.
So you're essentially standardizing those elements that I'm saying are variable, because you're going to assume, which I don't disagree with at all, right? Because if you're approaching this like a professional, you should be showing up ready to perform. You should be showing up with intent. You should be showing up with a level of, cognitive arousal that allows you to perform the lift that you're supposed to perform. And if we're adapting, right, if we're recovering from our training, there should be a linear relationship in your performance.
Mm-hmm.
That makes total sense to me, for sure. Um, all right, what's next? We talked about routine. We talked about intensity. What's next? What do you need to teach a young lifter?
Sure. I would say the next thing is muscle mass. So yeah, strength potential essentially boils down to like how much muscle tissue do you have, and then how well can you recruit that tissue all at once,
Mhm.
which is like the neurological component. But we get that part from just doing the lifts. So the big other part that we need to build is like actually putting on tissue, especially in younger, smaller lifters. So the biggest thing there is like well chosen accessory exercises.
Okay.
I don't think that squat, bench, and deadlift are necessarily the best ways to get jacked. So we want to like supplement that with other things. And the big points there are things that require less skill. So those main big lifts, we're trying to like master the performance of those. The accessories are things that don't necessarily matter in that regard. We're just trying to like push them for output. So they should probably be more stable as well, and then have like big range of motion. So I'd say like a leg press is the perfect example. There's a lot less skill required for that. It's more stable, but there's still a big range of motion. So that's a good
Well,
complement. Good
that's
complement to squatting.
well, the range of motion piece is something you're going to have to probably coach through your athletes. Most people get on the leg press and they do a lot of partials with a shit ton of weight.
Sure.
Um,
Put your feet at the very bottom of the foot plate. Get a lot of knee bend. Try and lean
oh,
the seat back a little bit so you get more like hip flexion.
for sure. But Michael, what about fatigue?
If we're talking about beginner lifters, like I don't think any of them are strong enough to like create a huge amount of fatigue on their accessories.
Podcast over. Biases all confirmed. Podcast over. Thank you. Like, yes, you have to be strong enough to actually accumulate fatigue.
And like even at my strength level, like I've squatted 500, I pulled
Yeah, you
620.
did.
Yeah. I don't necessarily see my accessories like bleeding over into my main lifts in terms of like having a ton of fatigue. Like I can definitely notice if I pulled a heavy deadlift last week and I go to pull a heavy deadlift again this week, like
Right.
there's a huge difference there. But I'm not like, oh man, I pushed those split squats too hard. Like that doesn't happen.
I totally agree. And it actually it chaps my ass so hard whenever I see these young lifters in cause our gym is quite unique because we do have a powerlifting side and a bodybuilding side. And when I see these powerlifters on the bodybuilding side doing their assistance lifts and just like going through the motions, I think you're better off just not doing them at all. Like if you're not actually going to get a stimulus from it, just don't even worry about it. Go home. If you're so delicate that you're afraid of training to failure, just go home.
Well, I think that might be a little bit of an overstatement because like there's other things that we get out of it other than just getting jacked. It's just we don't necessarily like talk about those as much. So like movement skill, control, learning how to like go through different ranges of motion, uh, all these kind of things that will like supplementally make you a better lifter too.
I do agree with you in the sense that there are secondary and tertiary effects aside from hypertrophy. My argument and the reason I say like, but just go home is because those adaptations require proximity to failure to actually elicit adaptation.
Yeah,
So, but in any case, we're on the same page. Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. So, you've got your routine, you're approaching your lift with the proper intensity, you're building some muscle. What's next?
sure. I would say there's actually like one or two more things on the building muscle front
Okay.
too.
Yeah.
Uh, so we made that distinction earlier that like main lifts can't be pushed super hard all the time
Yep.
because we want like submaximal practice so that we can like ingrain the skill performing it well. Uh, these accessories are a chance to like actually push harder. So this is where we can like go to failure. Um, and then the other thing on the muscle mass front is like eating. A lot of, well, it depends on the type of person. Like there seems to be a couple clear camps of like people that just routinely undereat, and then people that come into the sport like already on the fluffier side.
Husky.
Yeah. So at least for the people that start on the very skinny side, like eating is a huge part of it.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've always struggled with. Like whenever I started lifting, I was already 6'1" and only weighed 140 pounds. And I've gradually managed to make it all the way up to 210.
So here's a lesson to young lifters. Sour Patch Kids during training is not going to make you jacked. Uh, we talked earlier about evidence-based practice. Show me one big, strong person who got big and strong eating Sour Patch Kids during training, and I will shut up about it.
Yeah, like my personal preference there is like a sports drink, like
Yeah.
Gatorade, Powerade, whatever. That's plenty of carbohydrates and like energy to like finish training.
Yeah, totally. And it's actually like not going to gum up your intestines while you're training.
Yeah. I have a buddy, he eats like gummies whenever he's lifting,
Okay.
uh, but he's an Olympic lifter. So he'll do some like big, like mouth breath where he's like, like right before he goes. And there's been a couple times where he's like, ugh, I just like sucked a gummy out of my teeth and it got lodged in the back of my throat right as I went
Uh,
for like a big snatch or big clean.
oh my God.
Yeah.
That's listen, hey, eat big to get big, kids.
Yeah. I'd say the biggest things that helped me, like drinking calories. So milkshakes, milk, juice, sports drinks, all of those kind of things. If you can substitute some of those in place of water, then you're not really changing like how much stuff you're taking in throughout the day, but you're getting like free calories while doing it.
Yeah. The other thing is not taking 45 minutes to eat your meals.
I still do that,
I know you do. I know you
but
do. It's okay. It's okay. You'll grow up. It's just a phase of life. It's just a season. You'll get through it. You'll realize like I have a meal waiting for me as soon as we're done the podcast. It's going to be done in 5 minutes and I'm out the door to go train. Um, all right. What's after getting huge?
learning to create tension is a huge part of it.
Oh, amazing. Yes. Great point.
Yeah. So there's some big commonalities between all of the lifts. I would say like bracing is one of the key parts in terms of like the abdominal stuff, but also scapular depression. So like pulling your shoulder blades down, as well as retraction, pulling them back. And then like arguably you could also kind of say like packing the head. So like
Yep.
pulling the chin back, trying to make a double chin. It's a huge overlooked part of like squats or deadlifts or
Absolutely.
arguably even bench press. Like some people will have their
Yeah.
head lift up and then they flatten out their arch. Um, but the head position and like actively like try and create tension there definitely makes a huge difference in terms of having upper back tension as well.
One of my favorite, or sorry, I shouldn't say one of my favorite, but one of the telltale signs that I see in clients' videos, whether they're creating tension or not, is looking at their feet. Because if the foot isn't rooted to the floor, there's absolutely no ability to translate force up the chain.
Mm-hmm.
And so teaching the young lifters to actually connect with the floor is probably one of the biggest rocks that you can push over, because it'll bleed into pelvic position, bracing, and then all the way up the chain into rib cage position.
So, just out of curiosity, like on the topic of rooting,
Yep.
which model do you believe in and teach? Like the tripod foot, like trying to spread the floor, like any of those kind of things?
So tripod foot, but I will focus on creating downward pressure. So
Okay.
the cue that I will use the most often is heavy feet, as opposed to screwing your feet and creating an external torque, an external rotation torque through the hip. Um, I've seen that do more harm than good over the years,
Yeah.
unless the base of support is very wide. So if you have like a very wide stance squatter or a sumo deadlifter, I may cue that tripod torque through the floor, but that's only because we're trying to maintain that relative knee position over the foot. But as that base of support comes narrower and narrower, if you cue that external rotation, that knee is going to travel outside the framework of the foot, and then you're getting a whole bunch of torque through the knee.
Yeah. I'm totally on board with that. I feel like the like screwing the foot is one of the areas that I didn't necessarily agree with like Kabuki's
Yep.
methodology, for example. Um, like when we're lifting, all of the force is just down. The bar's on your back. It's not like shoving into your leg from the side. We
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily need to like create an excessive amount of like trying to push the knees out.
Right.
And if anything, you're probably making yourself weaker because internal rotation at the femur tends to be like a fairly strong kind of position. Like
Yeah, it's a huge driver. Yeah.
you watch a lifter like Amanda Lawrence, where she's got that crazy knee cave. A lot of people are going to look at that and be like, "Oh, that's ugly," but like, there's a reason why she's one of the strongest people. That's a position that humans can be very good at producing force in.
And there are arguments for and against this that I can totally get behind. Like, you speak to someone like Dr. Andrew Locke. Dr. Locke will vehemently oppose the knee valgus and the squat. And his argument is that if you look at limit strength, so not someone's relative max, but the actual heaviest lifts ever performed in competition, they are performed with pristine technique. And so I get behind that and I look at, okay, if you have these power leaks, it's probably creating some sort of glass ceiling to how strong you can get. And if you look at a lifter like Amanda Lawrence, you could argue that her quote unquote knee valgus isn't actually valgus because she's got a narrow stance. So, does her knee actually travel inside the framework of the foot for long enough? Like a little twitch in is a lot different than, knees kissing together. Right. So I would like, she's a very fringe example, like N of one. But in
Mm-hmm.
general, most people, when they look at knee valgus, is not actually knee valgus because, relatively speaking, the knee is still on top of the framework of the foot.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that French lifter, female, who has that crazy narrow squat and her knees actually do touch?
No, but I can imagine.
Oh, she's like all like very high in the lifter rankings, but yeah, she's a French lifter. She was actually visiting here in Ottawa, and I couldn't believe it. And at first, you're like, "What the fuck?" But then your analytical brain takes over, and you're like, "Oh, well, yeah, it makes sense
Yeah.
because the adductors are going to extend the hip."
Yeah.
I love the conversation of tension because one of my lifting mentors coming up, Jay Nira, a good friend of mine, would always talk about pay attention to the tension. The tension is your teacher.
Yeah.
Because if you go into positions of tension, that is where you are most strong. So if you avoid these positions of tension or you don't actively seek to create tension, you're leaving pounds on the platform.
For sure.
Sure.
I'd say the other thing is like creating tension is not just a skill, but it's also like a strength kind of issue.
Yeah.
If you're not like strong enough to create enough tension to resist getting like pushed out of position,
Well
uh,
said. Yeah.
yeah. So it's not just drills to practice. Like I see a lot of people talking about like, oh, here's a drill to like learn this position. But you also just need like exercises to train the strength of those movements.
Yeah.
So it can be simple stuff like lat pull downs, lat pull overs, sit ups, Copenhagen side planks. Like all of those are teaching tension more than just like, oh, stick a band around this body part and do this.
Jesus. All right. What's number 5?
I actually said understanding discomfort or like pain,
Yeah.
because ultimately, if you train for long enough or like pretty much do any athletic pursuit at a high level, there needs to be a distinction between like pain and injury.
Yep.
So just because you're experiencing pain doesn't mean that you did damage to a tissue.
Right.
Pain is just a sensation or like experience, multiple different things actually, but it's a thing created by the nervous system, like trying to interpret inputs.
Mm-hmm.
So like pressure, temperature, all those kind of things. Uh, so it can be just a perception of threat.
Yep.
And like if you're loading new positions or putting more stress on your body than it's used to, that could easily be perception of threat. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you've like done damage to tissues.
Yeah,
So
I
I
totally
think
agree.
a lot of people need to learn that takeaway because they're going to experience some pain or discomfort from training. And the initial thought is like, oh God, I did something wrong. When in reality, it's like, that's just going to be part of it.
Oh man, there's nothing more like a max single on a squat. Like that's not a comfortable exercise. And even things like even now in bodybuilding, like when I'm training for bodybuilding, it's like a high rep set of leg press. It still feels like you're dying.
Yeah.
Right? You're not scared that you're actually going to die because you're safe in a machine. You're not safe that your kneecaps are going to break off. But there is an element of tolerance to discomfort and almost blocking it out, because if you think about that pain too much, it will blunt your power output.
Sure. You're talking like during the lift. I more meant like outside of or around
Oh, okay.
training.
Yeah.
So a good example, when I went from 330 to 430 on squat in 6 months, so
Yep.
100 pounds, I had some pretty serious like adductor pain, quad pain, pretty much like every time I was squatting for at least a month or two. But it was only when I was training, it cleared up within a couple hours. It was always like a probably 3 out of 10 or like slightly less. It was nothing like crazy severe.
Yeah.
And I kind of knew why it was happening. It's because like I'm rapidly pushing this and like making a lot of progress. So I knew it wasn't like a concern or an injury or anything like that. Or just like random little stuff will pop up for most people, like, oh, my wrist hurts, but it doesn't like last. It doesn't have any like sort of significance.
Yeah.
But I would say like how you handle those kind of situations is a important thing to learn if you want to like be a good lifter, because most people's reaction to like something hurts is like, oh, I gotta stop moving it, or like don't do anything. Whereas if it's like insignificant pain, there's not an actual like real injury that happened. More often than not, the best course of action is like desensitizing it with motion. So do what you can handle that kind of like pokes the area. It's like
Right.
a 3 out of 10 pain or less.
Yep.
And like it gradually gets better as you do more reps. Do motions like that to the point where it feels better and better and better until it's not an issue anymore. And like keep training unless you have like some significant issue that like actually does stop you from doing those lifts.
Couldn't agree more. Let's transition to some quick hit questions here.
Sure.
Your favorite. Do you crack an egg on the side of a pan or on a flat surface?
Like if I'm doing it in a mixing bowl or something like that, I would use the mixing bowl.
You'd use a mixing bowl. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the scariest lift you've ever done in training?
Uh, all right. This is a pretty good one. So yesterday was actually my heaviest squat of prep for my next meet.
Okay.
I walked out and then I was like settling, and I'm squatting in knee wraps.
Yep.
I don't have this issue in sleeves, but I was kind of like settling with the weight. and I rocked back on my heels like so hard that I was probably, I don't know, like quarter inch from like straight up toppling backwards.
Yep.
Uh, and like at that point, there's like literally nothing you can do. Like the weight is so off balance, it would just fall and you're going with it. Uh, so that was pretty sketchy.
Did you take the squat or did you re-rack it?
I was fine. I mean,
okay, good.
I just like leveled back out and I was like, ooh, and then I just squatted.
Fuck yeah. Good on you.
But afterwards, it's a moment of like, oh shit, that could have been pretty bad.
Yeah. I had one where I unracked from a monolift and I was way too far on my toes and I literally just fell forward with the weight.
Oof.
That's a good one.
Oh, I've got one more now that I'm thinking about it. So when I was still pretty new to training, maybe like 6 months into lifting, I was working out in a friend's garage with him.
Okay.
And they were like a CrossFit kind of person. Their dad didn't necessarily have any like educational background in training, but he was like, all right, this is a workout we're going to do. We're going to like pyramid up to a top overhead press,
Okay.
like full on standing overhead press.
Love it.
And this is not a movement I'd ever really trained.
Okay.
So I'm trying to push some weight because I'm here with my friend, and I make it to the top, and then I like wobble and topple and fall over, like still holding onto the bar.
Oh God.
So my elbows hit the floor, still holding onto the bar, and I got an avulsion fracture in my wrist where the like tendon is rapidly stretched and like pulls off.
I'm very familiar with avulsion fractures.
Yeah. I guess you would be.
Fuck, man.
So yeah, that was my first lifting related injury.
If there was a billboard on the side of the highway with a message that everyone could read, what would it be?
Lift weights.
Oh my God, you're such a loser.
Well, I mean, the vast majority of our society still doesn't do any like physical activity. And most people have an ingrained like, oh, I shouldn't smoke cigarettes. I should drink alcohol in moderation. Eating too much food is bad. But there's still so few people that actually genuinely understand like you need significant load and stress on your body in order to like maintain your muscle mass and bone density.
I love that you reasoned your way out of that.
Yeah. Like it's a basic answer, but like it's a billboard for everyone, not just like what I would think would be coolest.
I thought it sucked until you talked about it, and then I'm okay. We're okay. Yeah. We're good. You
could make it like a cool design, like put some flames and something like that. Oh, I don't know.
The last question I have for you, who's one person you would like me to interview on the podcast? The caveat is that you have to help me get them on.
Okay. Have you talked to Brandon Morgan yet?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Yeah, I can set you guys up.
Awesome. Dude.
Yeah, so he was the director of education at Kabuki Strength whenever I interned there. For anyone that doesn't know, I think he's a great coach, very knowledgeable.
Great social media.
Yeah.
What are some things that you're working on right now?
Sure. So I'm just wrapping up a powerlifting program. It's my first like templated program that's meant to work for pretty much anyone.
Okay.
So it's centered around the fundamentals, not meaning like basics, but like the core aspects of the sport. And a big part of it was trying to make it where it would work for anyone of different strength levels, which is not as easy as it sounds because the needs of lifters like change over the course of their career.
Mm-hmm.
So like most beginners are not going to be able to handle like tons of volume because they're just getting started. Whereas like in the intermediate stage, it kind of curves back up. They need a lot of volume and they need more frequency.
Yep.
And then it drops back off as you get more advanced because you can't handle as much.
Right.
But all three of those kind of categories have like a range to it.
Yep.
So the goal was to kind of find the range that fit within all of them. So like if you've got this bell curve and they've all got a range, can I do a line straight across here that falls within all of those ranges?
Yeah.
Or like if I made a Venn diagram of like what would work for a beginner lifter and an advanced lifter, like choose the thing that's in the center in the overlap between them.
I love it.
So like a big part of the thought process for like making sure that the program will work is like choosing different like avatars.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so an elite level untested athlete, as well as like here's a brand new person on the collegiate powerlifting team. Uh, would this program work for both of these people? And I think ultimately the answer that I came to is yes. I managed to put something together like that.
Cool.
Uh, so I'm pretty happy with it. Like obviously individual coaching is always the best, but not everyone's going to be able to afford that or is ready to commit to that or anything. So I wanted to like put out a template that I thought was better than what other people are offering.
Well, just make sure to send me a link to that and I'll put it in the show notes. And
Sure.
I'll have links to where everyone can find you in the description. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and we'll catch you on the next one.